The damp, heavy air of the Lorraine region in eastern France during the early morning hours of September 19, 1944 clung to the steel hulls of the Panther tanks belonging to the German 113th Panzer Brigade. A thick, impenetrable ground fog had settled over the rolling agricultural valleys and shallow hills surrounding the town of Ericourt, masking the movement of massive armored formations and reducing visibility to mere yards. Within the command half-track of the 5th Panzer Army, General Hasso von Manteuffel studied his operational maps with a growing sense of profound dread. Manteuffel was an aristocrat of Prussian military lineage and a highly decorated veteran of the Eastern Front renowned for his tactical brilliance and deep understanding of mechanized warfare. He had been ordered by Adolf Hitler to execute a massive armored counteroffensive against the right flank of the United States Third Army commanded by Lieutenant General George Smith Patton. The strategic objective was to sever Patton's vulnerable logistical lines, drive a wedge into the advancing American front, and halt the relentless Allied drive toward the German border. To accomplish this ambitious objective, Hitler had stripped the Eastern Front and the strategic reserves of their newest, most potent weapons, deploying a series of newly formed panzer brigades to spearhead the assault. But Manteuffel, analyzing the true state of his forces, knew that the political mathematics of the German High Command bore absolutely no resemblance to the grim physical realities of the battlefield. The formations under his command, particularly the 111th and 113th Panzer Brigades, were a catastrophic illusion of military strength. To understand the tragedy that was about to unfold in the fields of Ericourt, one must examine the fundamental structural flaws of the German war machine in the late autumn of 1944. Following the disastrous collapse of Army Group Center in the east and the chaotic retreat from the Falaise Pocket in the west, the German army was hemorrhaging experienced manpower and material at a rate that the industrial sector could no longer replace. In a desperate attempt to rebuild his armored striking power, Hitler had ordered the creation of independent panzer brigades. On paper, these brigades appeared to be formidable instruments of war. The 113th Panzer Brigade, for example, was equipped with over 40 brand-new Panzerkampfwagen 5 Panther Ausführung G medium tanks straight from the manufacturing assembly lines. The Panther tank was widely considered by the German command to be the finest armored vehicle of the war. It was a massive machine weighing 45 tons, protected by thick, heavily sloped frontal armor that was virtually immune to the standard 75mm guns of the American Sherman tanks at combat ranges. It was armed with a devastatingly powerful 75mm KWK-42L-70 high-velocity gun capable of penetrating the frontal armor of any Allied tank from distances exceeding 2,000 meters. On a purely technical level, comparing raw armor thickness and muzzle velocity, the Panther was a terrifying apex predator. However, war is not fought on a purely technical level or on paper, and Manteuffel understood the fatal vulnerabilities hidden beneath the factory-fresh camouflage paint of his Panthers. The panzer brigades had been thrown together with disastrous haste. The experienced tank commanders and veteran crews who had mastered the complex tactics of combined arms warfare in Poland and Russia were dead or in Soviet prisoner of war camps. The crews manning the Panthers of the 113th Panzer Brigade were raw recruits hastily conscripted from the Luftwaffe, the Kriegsmarine, and shattered infantry regiments. They had received a maximum of 3 to 4 weeks of training before being loaded onto rail cars and sent to the front lines. Many of the drivers had less than 10 hours of operational stick time in the complex machines they were expected to maneuver in combat. Furthermore, the German logistical network was in a state of terminal collapse due to the relentless interdiction campaign waged by Allied tactical air power. The Panthers arrived at their staging areas with nearly empty fuel tanks and minimal ammunition reserves. The brigade lacked integral mechanized infantry support, adequate artillery spotting teams, and crucially, they possessed almost no organic recovery vehicles to tow damaged or mechanically disabled tanks off the battlefield. They were a blunt instrument, a collection of highly complex machines crewed by amateurs ordered to advance into the teeth of a fully integrated, heavily experienced American armored division. Arrayed against Manteuffel's precarious strike force was Combat Command A of the United States 4th Armored Division under the tactical direction of Colonel Bruce Clark. The 4th Armored Division was a fundamentally different organism than the German Panzer Brigade. If the German formation was a hastily assembled collection of superior machines crewed by novices, the American formation was a highly refined ecosystem of veteran soldiers operating a machine that perfectly matched their tactical doctrine, the medium tank M4, commonly known as the Sherman. For decades, post-war mythology would unfairly characterize the Sherman as a death trap, a vastly inferior vehicle that only overwhelmed the German armor through sheer numerical superiority. The historical and technical reality observed by Manteuffel and his commanders at Ericourt was vastly different and far more terrifying for the German war effort. The Sherman tank, specifically the M4A3 model utilized by the 4th Armored Division, was a marvel of industrial pragmatism and automotive reliability. While it lacked the heavy sloped frontal armor and the hypervelocity main gun of the Panther, it possessed a suite of technical and ergonomic advantages that, when utilized by highly trained veteran crews, made it a ruthlessly efficient instrument of destruction in the specific tactical environment of Western Europe. The primary advantage of the American Sherman tank was its unprecedented operational mobility and mechanical reliability. Powered by a highly dependable Ford GAA aluminum block V8 engine, the Sherman could travel hundreds of miles without requiring the massive maintenance overhauls that constantly plagued the over-engineered and underpowered Maybach engines of the German Panthers. American tank crews did not have to worry about their transmissions constantly shattering under the weight of their own vehicles, a daily reality for the German mechanics trying to keep the 45-ton Panthers operational. This supreme reliability allowed the 4th Armored Division to maintain an astonishingly high operational readiness rate, ensuring that when Colonel Clark needed a platoon of tanks to execute a flanking maneuver, the tanks would actually start, move, and fight without breaking down. But the Sherman's true lethality lay within the confines of its turret. The American tank was designed with a profound focus on crew ergonomics and rapid target acquisition. The turret of the Sherman was incredibly spacious compared to the cramped, claustrophobic fighting compartment of the Panther, allowing the commander, gunner, and loader to operate with maximum physical efficiency. This ergonomic superiority was magnified by the mechanical systems driving the turret itself. The Sherman utilized a state-of-the-art hydraulic turret traverse mechanism that allowed the American gunner to rotate the turret a full 360 degrees in less than 15 seconds, regardless of what the tank's engine was doing. By devastating contrast, the turret traverse of the German Panther was mechanically linked to the speed of the Maybach engine. If the Panther was idling or moving slowly to conserve its precious limited fuel, the turret rotated at a dangerously sluggish pace, taking over a minute to complete a full circle. In the fluid, chaotic environment of a close-quarters armored engagement, this discrepancy in reaction time was a fatal mathematical certainty. Furthermore, the Sherman was equipped with a Westinghouse gyrostabilizer, a highly advanced piece of analog electromechanical technology that stabilized the 75mm main gun in the vertical plane while the tank was moving over rough terrain. While American crews rarely fired accurately while driving at top speed, the stabilizer allowed the gunner to keep the reticle precisely fixed on the target while the tank was braking to a halt, allowing the American tank to fire the first crucial shot of an engagement seconds before the German gunner could even find his target in his optics. This principle of getting the first shot off was the absolute core of American armor doctrine, and the Sherman was perfectly engineered to execute it. The environment in which these two contrasting philosophies of armored warfare were about to collide was the rolling, undulating topography of the Lorraine Plateau. The terrain surrounding Ericourt was a complex mosaic of shallow valleys, blind defilades, small farm villages, and sudden ridgelines. It was not the flat open steppes of Russia, where the Panther could use its long-range high-velocity gun to destroy targets at 2,000 meters. It was a close-quarters tactical puzzle that favored mobility, situational awareness, and rapid reaction times, the exact attributes possessed by the American 4th Armored Division. On the evening of September 18, Colonel Clark, recognizing that a major German armored thrust was imminent, had positioned the tank companies and mechanized infantry battalions of Combat Command A in a deeply layered elastic defensive posture. The American commanders utilized the terrain masterfully, hiding their Sherman tanks behind the crests of hills in a reverse slope defense, leaving only the commanders' open cupolas exposed to observe the valleys below. The American crews were veterans of the breakout from the Normandy beachheads and the rapid pursuit across France. They understood their machines intimately. They trusted their highly reliable frequency-modulated radios to coordinate complex maneuvers, and they possessed an unshakable confidence in their tactical superiority. As the morning of September 19 dawned, the thick white ground fog rolled off the nearby waterways and completely blanketed the Ericourt battlefield. Visibility dropped to less than 50 yards. Within the command post of the 113th Panzer Brigade, Oberstleutnant Eberhard von Nostitz received the order to advance. The engines of the Panther tanks roared to life, coughing thick blue smoke into the damp morning air. Because of the fog and their complete lack of reconnaissance assets, the German columns advanced completely blind. They did not deploy scout vehicles or infantry screens to probe the terrain ahead. Instead, the massive 45-ton Panthers, grouped tightly together to avoid losing contact in the mist, rumbled straight down the agricultural roads and directly into the kill zones meticulously prepared by the American forces. The initial contact occurred shortly before 8 o'clock in the morning. An American outpost manned by a lightly armored M8 Greyhound armored car utilizing its radio detected the deep mechanical vibration of the approaching German tracks. The scout relayed the coordinates to the command post and quietly withdrew into the fog, allowing the heavy German armor to penetrate deeper into the defensive web. The engagement began not with a massive barrage but with isolated, terrifying encounters in the blinding mist. Elements of the 113th Panzer Brigade blundered blindly into an American tank destroyer platoon. At point-blank range, the fog momentarily parted to reveal the massive sloping glacis plates of the Panther tanks. The American anti-tank gunners firing their high-velocity 3-inch weapons achieved several immediate kills, penetrating the thinner side armor of the German vehicles before the fog rolled back over the burning wreckage. The green German crews panicked. Bereft of experienced leadership and unable to see the enemy firing upon them, they began to maneuver erratically, firing their heavy 75mm guns blindly into the mist, hitting nothing but trees and dirt. The rigorous discipline required to maintain a cohesive armored formation instantly evaporated. The German attack, which was supposed to be a massive coordinated thrust, fractured into dozens of isolated, confused elements blindly groping through the valleys around the town of Bézinguet-la-Petite. By mid-morning, the meteorological conditions that had shielded the German advance began to shift. The autumn sun climbed higher in the sky and the rising temperature began to burn off the thick layer of ground fog. As the mist thinned and finally dissipated, a scene of profound tactical vulnerability was revealed to the American commanders occupying the high ground. The commanders of the Sherman tanks, standing in their open hatches, looked down into the shallow valleys and saw the dispersed, disorganized elements of the 113th Panzer Brigade milling about completely exposed. The German Panthers were caught in the worst possible tactical situation. They were in the low ground, they were not facing the enemy with their thick frontal armor, and they were entirely unaware that they were being observed by dozens of American tank guns already calculated for range and elevation. Colonel Clark, observing the developing massacre from his command post, issued the order to engage. What transpired over the next 3 hours was not a battle in the traditional sense but a systematic mechanized slaughter that permanently shattered the myth of German armored supremacy. The American Sherman tanks, operated by men like Captain William Dwight, commanding a company of the 37th Tank Battalion, executed a textbook demonstration of armored maneuver warfare. Realizing that a frontal assault against the thick glacis plates of the Panthers was suicidal, the American crews utilized the rolling terrain to mask their movements, flanking the German formations. The Shermans would race through a shallow defilade, climb the reverse slope of a hill, and suddenly crest the ridge, completely surprising the German crews below. The ergonomic and mechanical superiority of the Sherman instantly dictated the outcome of these rapid engagements. The American gunner, utilizing his hydraulic traverse, would snap the turret onto the target in seconds. The gyrostabilizer allowed the gunner to acquire his sight picture as the tank braked to a halt. The loader, positioned perfectly within the spacious turret, rammed a 75mm armor-piercing shell into the breach. Before the inexperienced German commander could even locate the threat and scream orders over the internal intercom to his driver and gunner, the American Sherman fired. The physics of armor penetration at close range are brutal and unforgiving. The American 75mm M3 gun, while possessing a lower muzzle velocity than the German weapon, was highly lethal when striking the side or rear armor of a Panther tank at ranges under 500 yards. When the American M62 armor-piercing ballistic capped projectile struck the relatively thin 40mm side armor plate of a Panther, the kinetic energy of the impact shattered the structural integrity of the steel. The shell punched through the armor, sending a devastating spray of high-velocity metal spall flying through the cramped fighting compartment, immediately incapacitating the crew. The projectile itself then detonated its small internal high-explosive bursting charge inside the tank, igniting the unprotected ammunition storage bins or the highly volatile aviation-grade fuel feeding the Maybach engine. Within seconds, a direct hit would transform the heavily engineered 45-ton Panther into a catastrophic inferno of burning ammunition and melting steel, sending a column of thick black oily smoke high into the clear autumn sky. The German crews of the 113th Panzer Brigade found themselves trapped in a mechanical nightmare. When a Panther was hit and erupted in flames, the surrounding German tanks would desperately attempt to locate the source of the fire. But the American Shermans, utilizing the shoot-and-scoot tactic, would fire one or two devastating rounds and immediately reverse back down the hill, disappearing from sight before the sluggish turrets of the Panthers could even rotate to face them. The German gunners, frantically cranking their hand wheels or revving their engines to provide power to the hydraulic traverse, found themselves aiming at empty ridges. Then, from a completely different compass bearing, another platoon of Shermans would crest a different hill and deliver another volley of armor-piercing shells into the flanks of the panicked German formation. The superior tactical mobility of the American tanks allowed them to dictate the exact time and place of every engagement, running rings around the heavier, clumsier German vehicles. The sheer volume of fire projected by the American formations was overwhelming. The Sherman tank was designed for a high rate of fire, allowing an experienced crew to deliver 15 to 20 aimed rounds per minute. As the battle raged through the late morning, the valleys around Ericourt became a graveyard for the new generation of German armor. The air was filled with the deafening cracks of high-velocity tank guns, the mechanical screech of tearing metal, and the continuous secondary explosions of Panther tanks cooking off their ammunition payloads. German tank commanders attempting to organize a defense were frequently decapitated by American high-explosive shells bursting against their open cupolas. The inexperienced German drivers attempting to maneuver out of the kill zones frequently stalled their complex Maybach engines or threw their tracks while attempting sharp turns on the soft agricultural soil, abandoning their immobilized vehicles to be systematically destroyed by the advancing American infantry and anti-tank platoons. The lack of organic recovery vehicles meant that every Panther disabled by a broken transmission or a thrown track was a permanent total loss for the German army. The American crews, by contrast, fought with a coordinated, ruthless efficiency. They communicated constantly over their FM radios, calling out target coordinates, warning each other of flanking movements, and directing the fire of their supporting artillery battalions. They fought as a highly integrated organism of destruction, dismantling the disjointed German brigade piece by piece. General Hasso von Manteuffel, monitoring the frantic, increasingly desperate radio transmissions from the front lines, realized that his grand counter-offensive was collapsing into an unprecedented disaster. The reports filtering back to his headquarters were difficult to comprehend. The 113th Panzer Brigade, the vanguard of his attacking force equipped with the most advanced tanks in the world, was reporting catastrophic losses against a supposedly inferior American armored division. Manteuffel had expected heavy casualties, but he had also expected his Panthers to easily punch through the American lines and wreak havoc in the rear echelon areas. Instead, his prized armored formation was being systematically annihilated in the very first hours of the engagement. The German general recognized with a cold analytical clarity that the fundamental doctrine of the American army, their emphasis on mechanical reliability, high tactical mobility, massive artillery support, and overwhelming localized firepower, had completely neutralized the technical advantages of his heavy tanks. The American Shermans were not fighting fair. They were not engaging in long-range gunnery duels where the Panther held the advantage. They were fighting a war of maneuver, utilizing the terrain and their superior turret traverse to execute a flawless close-quarters ambush. By 11 o'clock in the morning, just 3 hours after the morning fog had lifted, the 113th Panzer Brigade was effectively destroyed as a cohesive fighting force. Over 40 Panther tanks, the vast majority of the brigade's armored strength, lay burning, heavily damaged or abandoned in the fields of Lorraine. The American 4th Armored Division had suffered only a handful of casualties, losing fewer than 10 Sherman tanks in the brutal exchange. The mathematical reality of the engagement was staggering. A numerically comparable force of medium tanks had utterly obliterated a formation of heavily armored, highly advanced fighting vehicles in a fraction of a day. This was not a victory achieved through sheer numerical superiority, a myth that would later comfort the defeated German generals. The American forces at Ericourt were actually outnumbered in terms of armored vehicles during the initial phases of the engagement. The destruction of the 113th Panzer Brigade was achieved through superior tactical deployment, vastly superior crew training, ergonomic and mechanical advantages that favored rapid engagement, and a complete mastery of the operational terrain. The aftermath of the battle presented a stark and horrifying visual testament to the shifting balance of power in the European theater. As the afternoon's sun beat down on the scarred landscape, American infantrymen and tank crews carefully picked their way through the burning wreckage of the German armored column. The massive Panther tanks with their thick sloped armor and incredibly long 75mm guns looked like the apex predators of the battlefield, but they had been slaughtered by a machine that prioritized efficiency, reliability, and rapid target acquisition over pure armor thickness. The American ordnance officers examining the destroyed German vehicles noted the massive kinetic damage inflicted by the 75mm M3 guns, proving that the standard American tank weapon was highly effective when employed with the correct flanking tactics. They also noted the incredibly poor quality of the German steel on the late-war Panther models, observing massive cracks and catastrophic spalling around the penetration holes, indicating that the German metallurgical industry was severely suffering from the lack of critical alloying elements like molybdenum and nickel due to the Allied strategic bombing campaign. For General Manteuffel, the destruction of his spearhead at Ericourt was a strategic catastrophe that doomed the entire Lorraine counter-offensive. Without the striking power of his panzer brigades, he could not penetrate the defensive lines of the Third Army. He was forced to order his surviving units to adopt a defensive posture, desperately attempting to hold the line against the relentless mechanized advance of Patton's armored divisions. The Battle of Ericourt forced a profound re-evaluation of armored warfare doctrine within the German High Command. The realization that their newest, most heavily armored tanks could be so easily dismantled by the standard American medium tank shattered the illusion that technological superiority alone could win the war. The German generals realized that a tank is not merely a combination of a gun and armor plate, it is a weapon system that must be integrated into a functional logistical network crewed by highly trained veterans and deployed in a tactical environment that maximizes its strengths. At Ericourt, the German army failed in every single one of these critical categories. They delivered their finest machines into the hands of amateurs, starved them of fuel and support, and threw them blindly into a masterfully prepared ambush executed by veterans operating a machine perfectly suited for the task of destroying them. The 3 hours of combat on the morning of September 19, 1944 stand as one of the most decisive tactical armored engagements in the history of mechanized warfare. The German tank commanders who survived the inferno to report back to Manteuffel spoke of the American Shermans not with the derision often found in post-war memoirs but with a deep professional terror. They described an enemy that appeared from nowhere, fired with devastating accuracy, and vanished behind the hills before a response could be formulated. They described an enemy whose turrets snapped onto targets with terrifying speed, an enemy that never seemed to break down, and an enemy that communicated and coordinated its attacks with a ruthless mechanical precision. The slaughter of the 113th Panzer Brigade proved definitively that the American industrial philosophy of producing thousands of highly reliable, ergonomically superior medium tanks combined with an uncompromising tactical doctrine emphasizing mobility and first-shot accuracy was the absolute correct formula for victory in the brutal, fluid battles of the Western Front. The burning husks of the Panther tanks scattered across the fields of Ericourt served as the ultimate incontrovertible proof that the era of German armored dominance had violently and permanently come to an end, obliterated by the rapid, precise, and relentless fire of the American Sherman.